when I graduated in 2007. I thought I was going to be a scientist. I studied molecular biology, ended up enjoying my time at an internship at a hedge fund a lot more than that. So I did that for 7 years. 3 of those years I spent in law school at the same time. But then when I finished law school, I had, I think felt like my learning curve had flattened from being a pure capital allocator. So I stepped down and founded a new kind of biotech company that I could, actually, you guys might be more interested in it than most of my political audiences. But the basic premise was give scientists skin in the game in the projects they actually work on. So if you're at GSK or Pfizer or whatever, Merck, you discover a drug or you develop it, you don't have personal upside in the individual drug that you develop. You do have various forms of asymmetric downside. And so people don't take risks unless they're the same risks that the other pharma companies are taking, because if you take the same risk and fail, but everybody else is failing in a therapeutic category at the same time, you're safe. But if you take a risk that other people aren't willing to take and you fail, then you experience budget cuts, maybe job security risks, social embarrassment, which is a big factor in big pharma as well, which in turn created an opportunity that I took advantage of, which was that there were systematically categories of drugs that went undeveloped, even after big pharma had, for a long time, spent a lot of money developing those drugs up to a certain point. So I built a business called Roivant, basically in-licensed some of those drugs in their early stages of development, phase 1 or phase 2, often for pennies on the dollar relative to what had gone into them. Often we would have scientists or drug developers who were passionate about that very project inside the companies who would come with those drugs because they wanted to develop them, but the big pharma company said that they weren't in that area anymore. And we built a pipeline of such drugs. The whole plan was some of them would work, some of them wouldn't. The successes would make up for the failures. And it's now a $10 billion public company. And it returned, unlike many private companies, returned $1 billion plus to shareholders before going public. And, continues to do well to this day. I led the company as CEO for 7 years. 5 of the drugs I worked on are FDA approved today. The one I'm probably most proud of is a drug that it's actually a biologic that is a life-saving therapy in kids. Another one's an approved drug for prostate cancer, but that was my world, is the point. Very different world. Maybe more similar to your guys' world now than the world I'm in now. Something funny happened in 2020, which was that in my own company, there were demands that I make a statement on behalf of Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd, it was a tragic death in May of 2020. By June, there were demands that I start making statements on behalf of BLM. And it was a funny time because only starting that February, I had ventured into actually exercising my voice as a citizen while being a CEO at my own peril, criticizing what was then the still new shiny object of stakeholder capitalism. So I published this piece in the Wall Street Journal. It generated some waves that February. A few months later in May, this George Floyd controversy comes up. And the long story short, I can go into it if you guys are interested, but over the next 6 months, a series of escalating events led me to face a choice the following January of, there's 3 advisors to my company that stepped down after I wrote I didn't intend it to be, but a rather controversial piece in the Wall Street Journal at the time.
What was the premise of the piece?
2021.
Yeah.
The premise of the piece was that it actually was controversial on numerous counts, but the basic premise was it was the first legal argument anybody had made that if the government is pressuring a private actor to do something that the government couldn't do directly, that was still state action. Now, the subtext is this was in the wake of January 6th, when there was widespread systematic censorship of political speech in this country. At least I believe there was. And so at the time I made that argument, it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory on the facts. No, that's not happening. It was also dismissed as a legal theory. This rube who happened to go to law school forgot his first year where the First Amendment only applies to state actors. Now fast forward 3 years, 2.5 years, we now know those facts were far worse than even I envisioned at the time. And actually, the legal argument that I made is now popularized by Clarence Thomas and others that are finding its way into our jurisprudence. But anyway, 3 advisors to the company found it so offensive that I would make this argument in public that within 48 hours of that piece, they resigned. And that was definitely a post-Jan 6 mood and reaction that I had to then make a choice, right? Because now this is having potentially an adverse impact on the company. I could either, call it a year where I experimented with expressing myself and, wearing my legal academic hat and call that a day and continue with biotech. Or legitimately, if I didn't want to have an adverse impact on my company, I could step down and really speak freely. I chose to step down, not in small part because the company was doing great. I had a successor lined up. So there was a fortunate set of circumstances. It happened to be the right time. I had just had my first son. My son Karthik was born in February of 2020. He was about to turn a year old. We were in a transitional phase of our life. COVID, we had a year away from the office. My wife was filling her fellowship. There was just a lot going on in our life that it felt like this was a moment for a life transition to focus on, there are a lot of people, talented people developing medicines, maybe some of them more talented than me. Roivant's a successful company.
Did you feel like you were being bullied into making a statement about Black Lives Matter by your own employees? And what's your thought, generally speaking, on companies being politically active and companies having a political voice? Because it has come up in our industry over and over again. You might know Brian Armstrong from Coinbase said, hey, we're here to do crypto, nothing else. Please don't talk about anything political. So what are your thoughts generally
Vivek,
on that?
You wrote a whole book on this, right? I mean, I read
a whole book, yeah.
I read your book, and it speaks a lot about the distinction between what the intention is in optimizing for shareholders versus the personal interests of the executives and those in charge, expressing their personal points of view through the corporation. And I think you had some points of view on where that should all go. But was that in part motivating for you to run for public office, and why president instead of running for a Senate seat or congressional seat or something else?
Yeah, so it turns out I wrote 3 books in the last 2 years, and 2 of them are about this topic. The first one is Woke Inc., which was for a general audience. And then there was a second one called Capitalist Punishment, which was specifically about the ESG strand of this in capital markets. And just so people are aware, my general view is that companies should focus on making products and services for people who need them without apologizing for it. And yes, that's how you maximize profit for shareholders, by having a worthy mission and sticking to it without taking on social missions that are best carried out by institutions outside of corporate America. I so much believe this that even before I ran for president, this actually does answer your question, Dave, is I actually thought the way I was going to have impact based on this. I enjoy being an author, but I'm not by nature just an academic. I like to do things. I started a company called Strive. It's an asset management firm that directly competes against the likes of BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. That's what I thought my next leap was going to be. Strive's first fund launched last August, and less than a year in, it's close to $1 billion in assets under management. I think it took JP Morgan 2 years to get to $1 billion when they got into the ETF business. That was what my journey was going to be, is within corporate America, restore the unapologetic pursuit of excellence over distracting and dilutive political, environmental, and social agendas. But the thing that struck me, I think late last year and last December, last year we had our second son, got a new company off the ground. You all know what that entails. It was very much an all-in experience doing that. December, we had some time to take a step back. And, my wife and I, we kind of take a moment to ask yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? It's not a conversation you often have or take time to do, but the question of the why. And it reminded me back of that experience I had at Roivant. You asked me, did I feel bullied? I didn't actually feel bullied. I think I could imagine someone in my shoes feeling that way, but I didn't feel like it was somebody cornering me to do something I didn't want to do. Others have had that experience. That wasn't quite how it felt for me. It felt like there's a group of people who followed me on this mission, who look up to me, who were disappointed in me, actually. And I think that was much harder than feeling like I was being bullied, was to have a group of people who followed me on this worthy mission of developing medicines that pharma companies weren't, that felt proud of that mission, that now felt disappointed in me. And that was much harder to deal with than the bullying, but that also opened my eyes to the fact that I'm here stridently fighting against BlackRock and the ESG industrial complex, which is a little bit of a deflection from the essence of what I actually think is going on at the real root cause, especially amongst young people in the country.